From the trenches of motorsports and Gearhead Central, this is RealTuners Radio, your all-motor, boosted, and nitrous-fed hour of power. Now, here's your hosts, the Reverends of RPM, the Faction of Traction, John Bewley, Scott Clark, Bill Fowler, Scott Evans, Mark Dahlquist, Mike Perduto, James Short, Tom Sewell, Brian Barnhill. This is RealTuners Radio.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to RealTuners Radio. Today is February 12th, 2020, and you are listening to episode 114. We'd like to thank tonight's special guest, Pete Nichols from Hughes Performance. He's going to bring us up to speed on all things transmission and torque converter tonight, as well as take questions from our live audience. And check it out, we aren't even charging you $25. So strap in, warm up the bullet, and let's make a pass. This is RealTuners Radio. Hold on. There we go. Got sound now. Sorry, everybody. Glad you saw that, said that. So let me start that over again. Welcome back, everyone. Sorry I screwed that up. There's my first edit for the night. Everybody take a drink. I'm sitting here talking.
There is sound on Facebook, however, so yay.
Button pushed. Yeah. No, there shouldn't. I mean, there shouldn't have been sound on Facebook, but whatever. I had my mic muted.
There was.
Okay. Well, everybody in Facebook, you're going to listen twice, and you're going to like it because you're not paying $25. Of course, there aren't, how many listeners? 16,000 viewers on the Ducks race for practice or for round one of qualifying tonight. Times $25 a pop. Plus, how many of them are going to forget that they signed up for a repeated monthly charge? Jeez. Anyway.
Scott, did you see that comment on YouTube?
No.
Hello from the class of 24 students in AT207, automatic transmission class at Lincoln Tech.
Oh, nice. Dude, James McEwen's class. What's up, you guys? Very cool. No, dude, we love those guys. We're trying to do a class down there. But good to see you guys, Lincoln Tech. I'm glad you're listening in, man. We'll try to make this educational. Actually, since this is a transmission discussion, it's probably going to be appropriate.
It's their automatic transmission class, and we have got the dude on this podcast
for
tonight.
Sure. So, just real quick, sorry, I'll just go through this thing again, but I apologize to the people who didn't make the 417 class. There's like 20 seats, I sold 22 because the 2 people won't show up probably. And then it sold out in like 11 hours. I apologize for that. I released it on Friday night at 10 p.m. thinking I'd be slick, and it just got filled up instantaneously. So I'm going to try and do another one. We're working on a Dallas-Fort Worth class, an Ohio class, and Frank Guerrero, who is the man in Las Vegas, if you went to that class. We're going to do a live stream class only from his facility. I will be looking in the next 2 weeks for somebody towards the end of May, last weekend in May, I think we're going to do it. I'm looking for some people to bring their cars, some Holly users if we could. But and maybe we'll convince Mr. Fowler or Evans possibly might have his bullet ready to go. So that will be cool. We'll demonstrate some really cool cars on his demo.
Won't be a Holly on it though.
Nope, an M-Tron. I'm fine with that. I need to get the Holly guy. I've got the M-Tron guy. I think I've got a Fuel Tech guy. I've got an MS3 guy. I need a Holly guy for that class, May 30th and 31st. But we're going to tune your car in front of a live streaming audience and see how that goes. I'm trying to get the people that want to do these classes covered, and I'm trying to make an affordable tier of classes for that one. So to that effect, we're talking about and maybe 20 people can sit in interactively on a webinar style class, and then as many people as want can view the webinar, and just like we're doing the stream right now. We'll have like a private Facebook group, and you pay us a lot less than a regular class, so that the guys that want to do it from home and want to experience the class but haven't had the coin to travel and come to one can do so. So that's kind of what we're trying to do there. So let's see tonight. What else do we have going on? Evans, is there any other current events wise, the Ducks race, right? Everybody knows about that going on right now. What's
a Ducks race?
A Ducks. I just call it the Ducks events. What is it? No Mercy, Lights Out, Sweet 29.
I'm kidding. God, even I know what it is.
Right. Yeah. Even the California guy knows. Jeez. So, it's like we said, 16,000 people were watching it, $25 a pop. That's $400,000 in speed videos. They went from zero to heroes real quick on that. Let's see. Guys are yelling at me in the chat already. Looks to be on my laptop.
Roger Posada asks if we will ever have a class in California.
Probably the first electric car tuning class. Sorry, I shouldn't have gone there.
Yeah. The problem I thought I used to not be able to sell seats out or classes and get like 6 people on the whole West Coast. Vegas was a tough enough one to fill, but now I guess there's some pent up demand, maybe since the channel has grown and people are interested in. We have a lot more remote tunes. People have worked with us and had good experiences, so now they more people want to do the classes. Yeah, man, I might do a California class. I might do a SoCal class. Maybe we work with Chad Reynolds or something on that. But anyway, look for the online class. That's going to be the weekend of May 30th and 31st. We're just going to present an entire 2 days RealTuner class via video stream, try to make it affordable and have a couple of tiers there for people. So that's about that. Let's go ahead and introduce our guest tonight. Bill Fowler, why don't you make the introduction? You're better at this and you're familiar with our guy here.
I am only so happy to do that. Tonight, as everyone knows, we have Pete Nichols from Hughes, Transmission Hughes Performance is on. I'm proud to say that I have been a Hughes customer for, everybody fall down now, 40 years. So I'm not kidding. I bought my first torque converter from those guys that long ago. And
that's before Pete was born.
Yeah, it was before and almost everybody on the show is born. In any event, nevertheless, it's been great products for all those years, and they're just killing it right now. We're going to talk tonight about some of the really new, cool, whizzy technology that people are really, beginning to hear about and understand, whether it's no prep or heads up or all kinds of racing. The products are great. They had a great show at PRI and SEMA. And so Pete is going to walk us through a lot of the technology, a lot of the questions that people have. So be sure to throw out the questions because Pete's amazing. I call him One Take Pete. We did some videos that we'll be posting later on this week from the PRI show about some of the new products. So if you missed something tonight or didn't catch the details, we'll have more information on that. Pete, why don't you share with the audience a little bit about how you came to be at Hughes, why in the world anyone would build a twin turbo Bara motor in a Comet, and some of the other craziness you're into, and then we'll dive into the meat of it.
Sure. Thanks, Bill. So I've been with Hughes for going on 11 years. I got my start here. I used to actually work for Loper's Performance here in Phoenix, Arizona, which is a pretty well-known local speed shop. John Loper started that back in the 70s, and I worked there for about 10 years, and an opportunity came up at Hughes, and the doors were kind of closing at Loper's on future opportunities. So it was a natural fit since I was used to already selling Hughes products and already pretty familiar with the product line. So I came on and transitioned into the sales manager role And I was in that role for about 7 years, and now I've transitioned into the purchasing manager role, and I handle social media and marketing and wear a few other hats around here. So that's kind of my quick background with Hughes. And as far as the project goes, 62 Fairlane, it's a Aussie Ford Intech single overhead cam straight six engine with a big turbo and a Powerglide, and all the bells and whistles. And I just like weird stuff, so that's kind of that.
Yeah. So, Pete, weren't you telling me that you guys have just completed and shipped the first 4L80 designed to be put behind one of these Aussie Bara motors?
Haven't shipped it yet. We are buttoning up the converter as we speak, but yeah, it's the world's first 4L80 that'll fit a Bara engine or the earlier single cam version of the engine. And that's going to be going in a pretty high profile project car down in Australia that's got some really good YouTube footage out already, and that'll have a feature on the 4L80 install as well. So we've already done 400s and Powerglides for those engines. That's worked out real well. We actually have our Powerglide in the world's fastest Falcon FGX down there. It's been 840 at 167 and change, 4,000 pound four-door sedan. So, and then Benny's 8-second Cresta, Ben Neal, who's over here on Drag Week for 2 years running. That's got our 400 behind the Bara engine in that. We have a few of them out there. So it's been a really good program for us. The 4L80E is a nice high strength overdrive option for that as well.
So if you were to talk about kind of the meat of the program at Hughes, what are the hot selling transmissions right now, and how are people equipping them maybe a little differently than they did just a few years ago?
I mean, the Powerglide, the Turbo 400, the 4L80, those are our big three as far as sellers go. We do offer product for all big three, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, but Powerglide 400 and 4L80E remain strongest sellers. As far as equipping, I mean, everybody on the show knows that horsepower is more readily available than it's ever been. You have guys literally taking junkyard LS motors with, everybody knows the combo, an S475 or S480 and, whoever's camshaft and Holly or whatever, and you make 1,000 horsepower without even trying. So got to have a lot stronger hard parts these days, a lot better friction materials, a lot better fluid. So we've constantly revamped and revised our product line to keep up with those changes in the aftermarket so that we're offering a product that not only performs well with all the newfound horsepower these days, but also gives the guys the durability and longevity you're looking for when you're spending $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 or $6,000 on a transmission.
So along those lines, in addition to all the other hats you mentioned, you're also the go-to guy for a lot of drag racers. A year and a half ago, we had Mike Giovannis here on the show.
Right.
He's had one of the quickest running small frame turbo cars just about anywhere. Lots of other people, friends of ours like Mark Cicino, all kind of interesting folks running the Hughes transmissions. Here's a question that comes up a lot. I'm building a 3,200 pound car. I'm going to do a little racing. I'm going to do a little street. I might be a drag week guy. How do I pick between a Glide and a Turbo 400?
That's a great question. There's a lot of myth out there. There's a lot of wives' tales out there as far as you got to run a Glide with this or 400 with that. And a lot of that's based around weight. What used to be true about that really isn't true these days. It used to be that, lightweight bracket type cars or cars that need a lot of horsepower is what guys would default to a Powerglide in, and then something heavier or lower horsepower, you had to have the 3-speed. Again, because horsepower comes in spades these days, it's kind of leveled the playing field as far as having a clear-cut right or wrong choice between a Powerglide or a 400. Ultimately, it really boils down to two things, in my opinion. It boils down to getting your starting line ratio set up correctly for how much power the car is making, the type of chassis and suspension, the type of surface and tire that you're racing on, and two, driver preference. Some guys just like the feel of a Powerglide from the driver's seat. Some guys like a 400, and so that plays a big role. But the black and white clear-cut lines of, heavy car, 400, light car, Powerglide. That doesn't matter anymore. I mean, a turbo car, you throw weight at it, and sometimes they go faster, so they respond to load. So you can have a heavy, 4,000-pound car with a turbo engine and still run a glide successfully. You can have a lightweight car with a 800 horsepower engine or a 400. So the lines have definitely blurred on that over the years. So it's one of those things where we just take all of the customers' data that they have available as far as engine combination, weight, chassis, suspension, tire type, all of that stuff, and we factor all that into our recommendation to try and build them a package that's going to perform well and it's going to drive how they want it to drive.
My apologies for my dog. He's decided something is coming in the window behind me. So other guys, ask a question for a minute while I deal with this.
You mentioned starting line ratio. Could you go over that a little bit?
Sure. So your starting line ratio is your low gear ratio in the transmission multiplied by your rear axle ratio. So say you were running a 370 axle ratio and you had a Powerglide with a 180 low gear set. You multiply those two numbers, and that's your actual starting line gear ratio. And so when you're dealing with a drag car or a real high horsepower street car, like a drag week car like Bill was talking about, and especially if you're on a smaller tire, it's really, really critical to get that starting line ratio dialed in correctly for the amount of power the car is making. Again, the coefficient of traction, tire compound and type, all of that plays a role in what starting line ratio is correct. Generally speaking, real high horsepower small tire cars, I kind of see a trend to where you just keep taking away starting line ratio to a degree and the cars just keep going faster. So of course there's a tipping point on that like there is with anything else, but it's definitely a big factor in what ratio we're going to put in the transmission and what ratio you need in your axle. It also has a big effect on how the converter's built.
So that brings up an interesting segue in the topic, how the converter is built.
Sure.
You've been making converters for a long time, and you have some really interesting new stuff. Describe a little bit how the converter is tuned. This show is primarily focused on drag racing. So as you talk about that interplay between starting line ratio, weight of the car, power of the car, maybe it's running on a 275 on a prep track. How do you begin to look at how you're going to construct a converter? And let's go with that typical thing. So it's a Fox body. It's got an LS conversion with that turbo and that setup. How do you narrow down what the converter package is going to be, and how do you explain to your customers how to think about that?
Well, with any converter, it's a load-sensitive device, so there's no such thing as a fixed stall speed, and that's important to explain to a customer to understand. So when we're getting into how we build the converter and the type of stall speed that it's going to provide, any converter is going to provide a range of stall speed based on the load it's subjected to. So the more torque the engine produces, the less ratio you have, the taller the tire you have, the more weight you throw at it. That's all going to make the converter stall correspondingly higher. So we have to take all those factors in, like you talked about when we're building the converter, and then we're going to focus on stator design. We're going to focus on impeller fin angle, and we're going to focus on clearance between the impeller, stator, and turbine as far as getting that converter dialed in. And we're going to select a stator that has the correct vane count and vane pitch to help manage the rate of torque multiplication that the converter is providing between the engine crankshaft and transmission input shaft, because the converter is a torque multiplying device. So if your engine's producing X amount of torque, the converter is going to deliver that much more to the input shaft as it's coming up on stall speed. And that torque multiplying factor is a diminishing ratio as engine RPM increases and the converter reaches its coupling point. So stator selection has the biggest impact on that as far as how hard we're going to hit the tire and how much torque we're going to deliver early on while the car is being staged and on the front half of the run, particularly to the 60-foot mark. Past that, you're running into where the converter is starting to really accelerate the turbine hard. You need more coupling speed. And we're going to focus on the impeller fin angle to control how that converter couples in terms of how hard it's driving the turbine, how quickly it's accelerating the turbine, and how efficiently it's coupling. So as far as how we get there, you know, a lot of it's tribal knowledge. A lot of it comes from years and years of trial and error, reviewing thousands and thousands of data files and just sort of figuring out what works and what doesn't. There really isn't a mathematical formula or equation or calculator that we plug everything into and say, XYZ components give us this final result. This is the correct converter. So it really just depends primarily on experience and knowing how to read data as far as ending up with the correct converter design for a given combination like that.
We got a question. If you find two combos that make the same starting line ratio, say a 180 first gear and a 355 rear, and then a 169 first gear and a 373 rear, what effect does the rear gear have on the car, and will it make a difference in the first 100 foot or be any different? I read that a little wrong, but that's the gist of it.
That's a good question. In that specific example where we're talking Powerglide ratios, you're really not going to front half all that differently. If we were getting into turbo 400s, that would be a different story because the gear sets based on the type of ratio that's in the 400 consumes more or less horsepower, and so that's going to affect the front half more. But on a Powerglide, specifically within that first 100 feet range, on paper, the car should perform identically between the two if you're playing with ratio to come up with identical starting line. Obviously, you're going to have a lot different aspects or attributes, I should say, on the gear change and in high gear, because that's when you obviously have a significant change in ratio between those two examples.
Pete, unpack something you mentioned in the process of the answer. You said that with a turbo 400, depending upon the gear set, there's a power consumption difference. Can you explain that a little more?
Sure. So with a 3-speed transmission, you have 2 planetary gear sets inside the transmission to create the ratios, whereas with the Powerglide, you have a single planetary gear set. So just right from a basic level, you're already turning more physical mass, so that results in more parasitic horsepower consumption straight off the board. In terms of the actual design of the gear sets and the ratios that are out there for the 400, there are gear sets that will consume more or less power based on the gear set design. So the Turbo 400 traditionally uses what's referred to as a Simpson-style gear set. And it is an efficient gear set, but it does take some power to turn. It's very strong. If you get into the close ratio stuff that's out there now, and Cone is the one that manufactures all those for everybody, apart from a couple of smaller guys that do their own stuff, the close ratio gear sets have been redesigned to where they're a departure from the original 400 Simpson architecture, and they actually consume considerably less horsepower than a Simpson-style gear set does. And you'll see those power differences in those different ratios that are available. So, for example, a 177, 140 gear set or a 177, 156 gear set may not consume quite as much power as, say, like a 160, 131. It's just based on which specific gear set you're looking at.
Another question from Facebook. Would you recommend to have a bolt-together converter for 2 different styles of racing, say a car that radials on the weekends and no prep stress street during the day, or just have 2 different converters they can swap back and forth? I guess, can you have 2 converters that far apart in one converter just with a bolt-together, a stator change or maybe a pump change?
Another fantastic question. So I guess the best answer is whichever you like. It's really whatever you're comfortable with. Yes, you can have wildly varying enough racing conditions based on the surface and how much power you're applying to where the vehicle may perform best with 2 significantly different converter designs. With the bolt together, obviously you're have the ability to tune it yourself, whether you're changing a stator, changing a pump, or just playing with clearances between the 3 components. If that's something you're comfortable doing, then yeah, I recommend a bolt together. They're awesome. They're easy to work on. They're nice to have if you have to service it yourself, or if you have an unexpected transmission failure. You can go in and clean the converter out. You can replace the bearings easily. You don't have to deal with shipping back and forth. So I'm a big bolt together fan. That being said, if it seems like a little bit of black magic to you, or just really not comfortable servicing a converter, which is reasonable. I mean, you can turn a stator upside down. The converter will still work, but it'll change how the car reacts completely. Then having two different welded converters is definitely a viable option. All this being said, with the rising popularity of torque converter dump valve systems, that's also a really good equalizer as far as converter tuning goes, and having spare converter parts or two different converters. A lot of what you used to have to juggle with converter tuning changes can now be accomplished with a dump valve system and just a single converter. And that makes life a lot easier. So the right converter with a matched dump valve system pretty much takes care of any possible issues you may have as far as swapping converters in and out, swapping stators, that kind of thing goes.
So can you, once again, we're going to unpack something a little bit. Can you unpack the idea of dump valves a little bit? Single stage, dual stage dump valves. I believe you guys are offering both of those now for Powerglides and Turbo 400s. And what are people able to do when you're talking about, instead of I'm swapping converters, now I'm doing something that I can do external to the transmission with the dump valves?
Sure. So there's a few different ways to manage converter oil with the dump valve system. And there's a lot of different systems on the market. Some work really, really well, some not quite as well as the others. So you have converter charge oil. That's your oil that's entering the converter. It's being ran through the pressure regulator circuit in the valve body or the pump, depending on which transmission we're talking about. And then filling the converter with fluid. Then you also have your converter exhaust oil that you can manipulate. So that's the oil that's traveling out of the converter to your cooler circuit. And that's true of any automatic transmission with a converter. It's your cooler circuit is always your converter exhaust oil. So you can manipulate either side of the converter oil. Typically, the converter charge oil, dumping that oil gives you a much more noticeable increase or management over how the converter reacts, because you're interrupting the oil that's being fed into the converter. So you get a lot faster reaction out of the hydraulic system. With the exhaust oil dumps, like on a Powerglide, for example, an exhaust dump on a Powerglide basically does nothing for you in terms of actual increase in stall speed, unless it's combined with a charge dump. On a Turbo 400, if you were to just bolt a solenoid to your cooler fitting and dump oil, it's not going to do much, if anything at all. However, we do have an exhaust side single stage dump for the 400 that's incredibly effective because of the modifications that we do to the pump stator to help facilitate converter cavitation and actually get the converter to evacuate fluid more quickly than what it's being charged with through the regulator system. So we're just running fluid out of the converter so it can't stay full. That creates cavitation, stall speed increases, torque multiplication is reduced, and you're basically turning your converter into a slipper clutch, so to speak. And with the dump valve system, you can manipulate that from anything from like a simple on-off, like the dump's on when the trans brake is engaged and it's off when you let go of the button. Or you can pulse width modulate the dump valve, at least with ours you can. If you have like a Holley Dominator engine management system, or Leash Electronics makes an actual dump valve controller now.
Basically any ECU, yeah.
Yeah, so you can PWM control the dump valves for down track management to help manage your converter tuning and manage your drive shaft acceleration. And there's so much you can do with them. Whether it's a turbo car, a nitrous car, a blower car, they work in everything if they're tuned right. So it's a really nice addition to any hardcore drag racing program.
So when you talk about that addition, what's involved in that? Is this something I can add, at home in my garage, or do I have to send the transmission back to you guys? What's involved in installing a dump valve?
So obviously I can only speak to our product specifically, but with our kit, I can honestly say it's the most complete, inclusive kit currently in the market. You're buying a Powerglide or 400 kit. It comes with everything you need in terms of the valve, mounting bracket, mounting hardware, fittings, hoses, seals, gaskets, everything you need for an end user to complete a successful installation. We also include a really comprehensive full color instruction manual, step-by-step install instructions along with pictures. So yeah, it's a very, very simple kit to install if you have some basic automatic transmission working knowledge. You certainly don't have to be an expert to achieve the installation yourself at home with basic hand tools.
How long does that take normally?
So once you have the transmission on the bench, our 400 single stage kit, if a guy's been in a 400 before, he could probably have it done in the space of 2 or 3 hours. On the Powerglide, there's a little bit more involved as far as what drilling and tapping. But I think it'd be reasonable to say you could have it done in, a space of 4 to 5 hours tops.
Easy enough. Gentleman asked, he's curious as to what point you recommend running an aluminum drum in a Powerglide. Is it RPM related or horsepower related? And is the gear change effective? He's got a 9,000 RPM 2JZ combo.
So we don't actually ever run aluminum drums in a Powerglide unless the customer's absolutely adamant that they want an aluminum drum. There actually aren't that many people in the market making aluminum drums in a Powerglide anymore. The aftermarket forged steel drums that we use from Sonics are basically bulletproof. We've had customers turn them well over 10,000 RPM with no issue. So the durability versus whatever minimal gain there might be between a good aftermarket forged steel drum and an aluminum drum in a Powerglide, it's really just not worth the hassle of the aluminum drum. The problem with the aluminum drum and the Powerglide is your band rides around the outside of the drum, and so you're always going to have accelerated drum wear and band wear to deal with an aluminum drum because of the soft material. And that puts contaminants into the transmission, into the converter. It's just a higher maintenance package, and it's just so unnecessary that the forged steel drum is really the way to go.
Are you normally seeing an aluminum drum in a class like super stock?
Yeah, you'll see it in super stock, comp eliminator stuff. That's about the only place you'll see the aluminum drum and a glide used these days.
Typically, you normally see the aluminum drums in Turbo 400s, not in glides.
Yeah, in the 400, you'll see definitely is beneficial in the direct drum. Can definitely also be beneficial in the forward drum as well, depending on the application. And there's even billet titanium drums, and there's machined lightweight steel drums for the 400. The sky's the limit in that platform.
I just hear the phrase billet titanium drums. Holy smokes.
My wallet's hot thinking about it. Like,
Yeah.
My 401k is bleeding.
It's not for the faint of heart.
Oh, man.
Burnt.
So there were some follow-up questions. There was also a question on fluid, which we will come back to, but we've got some dump valve follow-up questions. So thought we'd catch those first. Are there any drawbacks or other special considerations when using a dump valve? This is from Pro Harness.
So the way our dump valves are set up, they're normally closed valve. So if you're not using them, the transmission and converter don't act any different than if you didn't have them in there. So yeah, there's really no foreseeable drawback. The valve that we use is a 1/4-inch orifice cartridge style valve. It's the highest flowing valve on the market as far as what's being used in dump valve systems. The solenoid coil winding only draws 2 amps. So they're really, really easy on the electrical system. So as long as you have room for the actual packaging of the valves in the chassis, and you don't mind some additional plumbing that's going to have transmission fluid running through it externally on the outside of the transmission case, there's really no drawbacks.
So for some of the guys at 417 Motorsports are asking, does using a dump valve add increased heat to the converter or system, probably meaning is it adding heat into the fluid? Is that the case? And if so, how do you manage it?
So anytime you're cavitating the converter, you're running it low in fluid, and you're also aerating the fluid. And with fluid aeration comes heat. So yes, while you're staging with the dump valve active, you may notice a marginal increase in heat. That being said, Beaterbaum's a good example. He was very successful early on with our two-stage system, really well known on the streets and in no prep racing circles. And with our dump valves and pulse width modulated control in our converter, that transmission, I mean, in the data, it run anywhere from 140 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. So as long as the cooling system's up to par and the converter's right, the little bit of heat that the dump valves add while staging, it's going to come right back out as soon as you're accelerating down track.
So there was one other follow-up question on this, which was just kind of checking something, which is Leash has a dump valve controller. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So if you have, say, like, a blow-through carburetor deal, where you obviously don't have that ECU with those additional inputs and outputs to control it, or maybe you have an older EFI system that just works really well for you and that you're comfortable with, but it doesn't have any extra inputs or outputs to work with, then that Leash dump valve controller is a really nice solution for those type of customers.
I just happened to see a picture go by on the screen which showed the dyno that you have at Hughes. Can you explain what the use is of a transmission dyno and why it's important in your view?
Sure. So our transmission dyno is made by Superflow, and pretty standard equipment in our industry, really. We dyno test every single transmission that we build here. And really it's sort of our last safety net against potential issues for our customers. So if there's some unseen flaw, say in a transmission case or a pump body or something like that, or you have a porosity issue that could potentially cause a pressure leak internally, or, any myriad of issues, the dyno really helps us catch those problems. And it's not 100% perfect, but it's as good as we can possibly be as far as preventing, potential warranty issues, premature failures, that type of thing. So when we dyno test a transmission, we're going to check it for line pressure, we check cooler pressure, we check cooler volume, we check operating temperature. If it's a trans brake equipped unit, we'll test the trans brake function on the dyno. If it's a dump valve equipped unit, we'll test the dump valve function on the dyno. And we hook the output shaft up to the brake unit so that we can simulate a load against the output shaft and load it properly against the trans brake. So it's really just a super valuable diagnostic tool for us.
Cool. There's been a couple of questions go by regarding fluid in transmissions. And, over the years, there's a lot of, no, you got to run Type F. No, you have to run Dextron. No, you have to run this. No, you have to run that. Can you shed a little light on fluid selection and fluid types to be used in the different types of transmissions?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So when it comes to fluids, there's some really, really good fluids out there, and there's a pretty big variety of them these days. We actually have our own fluid blended for us by High Performance Lubricants out of Illinois. We call it our Extreme Racing Synthetic Type F formula. And so it does have some of the properties of Type F, which has obviously been popular for decades. But it's got a lot higher viscosity index, much more thermally stable, much more resistant to high temp. And that's true of a lot of good fluids out there these days. The old standby of you got to run Type F, or you got to run this, or you got to run that, just really isn't true anymore because there are so many good fluids out there. So what it really comes down to, what fluid is right for you, is working with your manufacturer to make sure that you have a fluid that's compatible with the friction materials present in the transmission. So there's going to be different friction modifiers in different fluids out there. There's going to be different anti-foaming agents. There's going to be, different levels of lubricity that different ATFs offer. And not all those different ATFs are compatible with all the different friction materials that are available. So, like, let's say you took our Extreme Synthetic Type F racing formula and you ran it in an old Turbo 350 that's got 100,000 miles on it, it's never been rebuilt, has the original Brown GM clutches in it, it's not going to last very long because our fluid isn't formulated to run at stock line pressure with stock shifts, with stock friction materials. So, in a situation like that where you're dealing with an OEM transmission, there's not really arguably anything to be gained by changing to any type of trick fluid. You just want to stick with what the manufacturer recommends. When you get into the aftermarket transmissions and you have, red friction materials, blue friction materials, high energy friction materials, there are different fluids out there that work really well with those different friction materials. And it's consulting the manufacturer of your transmission to select the right fluid for that material.
All right, I'm going to hit you on the fluid question, and I'm going to go back somewhere else. Well, but basically a double up. Guy's got a Powerglide turbo car. He says he changes the fluid every 2 events. What should my fluid look like? He says there's quite a bit of friction material in it. Is that normal? And a follow-up question is always the one that I don't like to I'm not a fan of it, but everyone always asks about the high guard. And obviously running the high guard, you're going to have a different look to that fluid that comes out. So I think depending on what fluid's in the transmission, that's going to change. But what's your stance on high guard, and what do you feel like the fluid should look like when it comes out of a turbo car after, say, 2 events?
For your, say your average street strip turbo car, like we've been talking about, your, stereotypical Fox body LS deal, that fluid after 2 events should, if it's the right fluid and the converter and tranny are right and the gearing's right, everything in the combination is happy, that fluid should look like the day you put it in after 2 events. If we're talking about, a radial versus the world car or pro mod, that's a whole different story. And that fluid after 2 events might just be absolutely smashed just because, at those power and performance levels, it's hard on parts, and fluid's a nice sacrificial item for that. So if everything's right and temperature's being maintained properly, that fluid after 2 events really should still be in good shape if it's the right fluid. Going back to our fluid, you can actually get it to turn color and turn, tan to where most guys think it's burned. And it's not actually burned. We've ran it through HPL's labs on used fluid samples. And you could filter out the particulates and put it right back in a transmission because it hasn't lost any of its friction modifiers, lubricating properties, or any of its ability to manage temperature. So, it's really dependent on the fluid he's running as far as what it should look like. As far as the friction material question goes, as far as how much is too much or is this okay, there's really no good way to answer that without tearing the transmission down and physically inspecting the band and the clutch packs. Automatic transmissions can be kind of funny. When they look like a lot of material in the pan, reveals itself to be hardly anything as far as any measurable or visual wear on the friction materials. So what may look bad in the pan may in fact actually be a completely healthy transmission. As far as the high guard stuff goes, some guys live by it and some guys hate it. We've had a lot of customers run it. It is a good fluid. The only goofy thing that we've seen with high guard, and this isn't even consistent, so take it with a grain of salt, is that in really high horsepower stuff, say, 2,000 plus horsepower, we have seen the high guard seem to have film strength issues in the planetary gear set as far as how well that film strength is being maintained between the gear teeth. And we've seen some fretting or some pitting or galling in planetary gear teeth at those elevated power levels with high guard. So, for a guy who's making 1,500 horsepower, he's never going to have that issue, in my opinion. But the real high horsepower guys, there's definitely better oils out there that should be using. AMSOIL compressor oil has gained a lot of popularity over the years as a replacement for high guard because it offers a lot of the same coupling abilities that high guard's kind of become known for as far as converter efficiency goes and being really resistant to high temp. But we've noticed on the gear train that the compressor oil does a lot better job of maintaining lubricity than the high guard does in the high horsepower stuff. That being said, shameless plug, use our fluid.
And obviously that's only fair. your fluid, all of the fluids are advertised as a Type F, which means that they have a Type F friction modifier package. At least that's how I used to understand it. Is that correct, or is that just old wives' tales about friction modifiers and fluids?
No, that is correct. And the reason that the Type F was so popular is because the friction modifier package, it offered extremely fast, firm, aggressive engagement of the clutch packs. Very, very minimal slippage at all as the clutch packs are applying. And, in a drag racing environment where gear changes need to happen quickly and efficiently, that's obviously advantageous. So that's why the Type F gained its reputation in the racing industry, and why our formula is basically, a synthetic, really high-end version of a Type F with some extra tweaks to it.
So along those lines, there's always a lot of discussion when people start saying, well, I got to do this, I got to do that. I'm rebuilding my trans, and what, people talk about choline blues and choline reds and raybestos reds and all of those things when they get to the friction materials. Beyond just relying on my trans builder to make the right selection for what I'm doing, what should I be thinking about or asking as a consumer of these products when it comes to some of these, brand names or things that we hear about?
Well, the friction material that's correct for your application is really based on how the vehicle is being used and how much power you're generating. So, like your high energy friction material, which is basically kind of your first level of improvement over an OEM friction material. That stuff's generally good for, 1,000-ish horsepower. There's some guys that have thrown more at it than that, but it's a really nice material for an entry-level friction that's affordable and will handle, pretty decent amount of power, at least in a street car. Your red friction material, generally speaking, is good up to about the 1,500 horsepower range. We've thrown more at that, more power than that at the red friction material for years, and it's always performed well for us and never given us a problem. So take that 1,500 number with a grain of salt. The blue friction materials that are out there, that works real well at extreme high horsepower, say 2,000 and up. We do use the blue stuff in our high horsepower builds. There's some other materials out there too, like the GPZ material from Raybestos or the G3 material from Alto. And those are arguably even better than, some of the other colored friction materials out there. And those friction materials actually arose more out of a solution for OEM friction material issues than they did for racing, and they just happen to adapt well. So again, you just got to consult with the manufacturer and deal with a tech and salesperson that's willing to, educate you and help you determine which friction material is right. Hughes has always kind of been known as a red friction company, but we use all of them depending on the build, high energy, G3, all of it. It's based on the specific build and the package.
So I was one of a number of participants on a thread today about how to properly activate a trans brake. And while, whether you have a button on the steering wheel or on the shifter or something is going to be a lot about personal preference, is there a set of best practices associated with a trans brake usage? And if so, what are they, so that people don't hurt stuff or lose?
Oh, well, the biggest thing with that is, not staying on the button so long. You're overheating the solenoid coil, because as it's the same as any solenoid in a vehicle. The longer it's active, the more amperage it's going to draw and the more heat it's going to generate. So if you're getting into staging battles and that kind of stuff, and you're on the brake for a long time and you're trying to go rounds, you're not doing yourself any favors by being on the brake too long. In terms of that, as far as where to put the button, it's literally entirely driver preference. It's whatever you're comfortable with. That being said, I prefer to see them on the steering wheel, only because it's a lot less likely to have accidental engagement than it is on the shifter, especially if you are still operating the shifter yourself instead of having an air shifter or electric shifter. you generally don't want to be bumping that trans brake button going down track. That can ruin your day pretty quickly depending on the transmission type. So yeah, it's mostly preference.
The only one thing I think I can add to this whole conversation is that the trans brake solenoid on my own personal vehicle draws about 10 amps when I'm using it. So just for people who are thinking about it and are doing the electrical wiring, just keep that in mind when you're doing your trans brake wiring. The wire going to the transmission needs to be able to handle at least 10 amps, maybe more depending on the solenoid, and needs to be able to hold that for a considerable length of time that you're standing on it.
100% right.
And the flyback voltage from a trans brake solenoid can cause all kinds of problems.
100%. And there are solenoids
it carries a lot
out
of
there.
current. It's going to send a lot of noise.
Yeah. There's solenoids we've seen that some of the oversized stuff that, once they get hot, they'll start pulling 30 or 40 amps when they get really heat soaked. So
Yowzer.
definitely want to keep aware of that.
So that obviously puts a consideration, because a lot of people have a tendency to think that, oh, I'm going to have a big wire on the positive side and I'm not going to think about the ground anymore, but that's not exactly how the electricity flows.
Some of them are grounded through the case. So just remember that, Bill.
Sure.
I think you have one that's two poles, I think. But go ahead.
Yeah, I happen to have one of those. It's the Hughes Pro, because in full disclosure here, I am a full-on Hughes customer. I have a really nice Powerglide that was set up to work with the gear vendors, which is an amazing compact package, which I needed for the little tiny tunnel in the car that I have. But Mike and Scott, you guys both mentioned some things about flyback voltage from solenoids, and people have mystery problems with cars. Can you guys, give Pete a rest for a second and unpack that whole idea about what are these problems associated with, trans brakes?
Waiting to see if Scott goes before I do. We've had significant issues where it'll actually knock the output out of an ECM out. The flyback voltage letting go of a solenoid. And we also had a car, it would actually kick the nitrous solenoids off, like it threw all kinds of flyback voltage and caused issues with my, we used to use contactors to kick the nitrous kits on. And for a split second, when the trans brake solenoid would shut off, it would cause like a hiccup. The solenoids would come on and shut off real fast until that cleared out. I'm sure there's way more technical explanation than that. I've just personally seen electrical issues from the trans brake shutting off without any kind of buffering. And I personally use the little Holly part, I forget what they call that thing, the resistor, whatever they put in line.
It's a diode, right?
Yes.
Or just use a good solid state relay in line instead of the standard cheapo relay. Don't wire it straight to a button. Put something in between it to act as the buffer.
Agree.
One of the biggest problems I found is guys wire it straight to the button. That's all fine and well if you're, old school carburetor distributor and you're bracket racing at 1150s. But if you're gonna put any real power to it and put some EFI in the system, make sure that you're going to use something as a buffer between it to keep all that flyback voltage and all the noise that flyback voltage causes through all the rest of the system. Because I've seen the same thing. So
it's also better not trigger off of the hot side. Trigger off of the ground side. Have it triggered via ground and pick up off that your ECU. Generally, the noise issues are more sorted out on the ground sides and less of a chance of damaging something versus tap it into what's popular when people see, a Holly will take a 12-volt input. Well, I'll just tee that into my existing hot between my trans brake button and the solenoid, and that line between the direct to the button feeding 12 volts to a solenoid, that has got a lot of noise going on from the switch and from the solenoid, and that's what'll screw up the input. That's when you need the little diode. But if you do it on the ground side or a ground method, you're fine.
Input isn't really made to handle all the amperage either that comes off that flyback, and you can actually fry the input of it coming in if that flyback voltage is too high.
That's why they give you the little, I think it's a diode.
Knowing what your ECU is too, because a lot of those will do that protection internally. I know the Mtron on some inputs, on most of its inputs, will do a lot of that as well.
We're going to fly Brian out to Vegas.
So I think it bears repeating about this issue of using relays, because on this same thread, and By the way, I'm going to call out my old buddy Mark Cicino there, but he was the one who posted this today. And there were a lot of people posting, oh, I just run a button. I don't run a relay or anything. I think somehow people have gotten the idea that a relay somehow makes the reaction of the system slower. So, oh, I'm just going to run a Biondo button. And
bracket racers, bro. And then they wire the reverse lights into it too, right?
Yep, that was the other half of it, Mike.
Mike's been around the block for a youngin'.
Yeah.
He's the village bicycle.
Well, yeah, so conversely, I've got a little unit that came from Spaghetti Menders that uses a solid state relay, and it's actually a separate, whole potted little deal that manages the trans brake function as well as triggering the two-step on the negative. So that was all part of having to do a gender change, if you will, in the professional performance products. I can never figure out that company's name. Performance Professional Products.
Professional products.
Yeah, those cool. It's a really cool shifter. I love the shifter, but the name is too long. So, but anyway.
So have you ever noticed that the guys complaining about the electronics being too slow are red lighting all the time?
No, interesting. Okay, I'm listening.
Okay, Mark.
Yeah.
Mark works on some brackets, some index cards.
He got shy.
Yeah, every
bracket guys.
Every single
with that. Yeah, the bracket guys, they overanalyze everything when it comes to letting go of that button.
Yeah, and then they red light.
Yeah. So a long time ago, like everything else I've ever done in my life, I did a bunch of bracket racing and stuff. And, I worked with leaving, again, this was a not sophisticated car, against the line lock. And was I faster with my thumb or my index finger or my foot? And I can tell you one thing, attempting to leave by using your leg is way slower than a finger. Just take it from me, boys and girls. That's true of every human in the universe. Now, whether a thumb or, and some guy today posted, oh, the elbow is quicker. And it's like, really, dude? But,
where am I missing all these erudite Facebook?
I'm wondering. I got to read about those, man. I want to see the guy in his car with the elbow on the trans brake button.
Yeah, I know. It was just like, be serious. However, we do have some really cool, serious follow-up questions. So, Pete,
yeah, they're piling up. Sorry.
They're piling up. So we're going to come back to them. So Paolo asks, would you use the blue clutches in a 1400 wheel horsepower turbo car? So
I will answer that, but can I back up to the wiring real quick?
Yeah.
He was waiting for us to shut up.
Solid state relays. Solid state relays definitely your best friend. In the past, we've even recommended against relays and trans brake circuits only in the context of don't go down to your local AutoZone and buy a $4 relay and put it in your trans brake circuit, because it's either destined for quick failure or it could potentially slow the circuit down. That being said, modern solid state relays, definitely a win on the trans brake circuit. For guys that are running conventional triggering and still grounding the solenoid in the conventional method, please don't ground your solenoid to dirty, oily, painted transmission cases or cross members or frame rails. You need a good, clean ground. You would think
every one of those.
Explain that, but they'll have a 3-cent crimped connector on there and be grounded to the painted transmission case, and then they wonder why they have weird issues. Please don't do that. Ground the solenoid to a really good source of ground. If you're going to ground to the case, make sure you have a ground strap between the case and the chassis. Make sure your chassis grounds are free of paint. All of that. You got to have good grounding systems. So, getting that spiel out of the way, moving on to Paulo's blue clutch question and a 1400 horsepower turbo car. You absolutely could run those in there with no issue. You could run the red clutches at that power level with no issue. If you feel more comfortable with the blue clutch in there, it's not going to hurt anything. I feel like the blue friction material takes a little bit more heat than the red does. So in a turbo car where you're typically dealing with more heat management and working the converter harder, a blue clutch is never really a bad idea in a turbo car. The Alto G3 stuff is also really good. The Revestis GPZ. Any of those materials are a great choice in a turbo car for sure.
All right, the age-old question, because we've all heard the horror stories of clicking a car in neutral and it saws the transmission case in half.
Yes, I saw that question.
Yes, what is the difference? How do we do it? When do we do it? Why do we do it?
Dustin Coleman, thank you for asking that question. So never neutral a 400 at the end of a pass unless you have a clean neutral valve body and corresponding shifter. So what happens when you're in high gear in a 400 and you click to neutral? Your direct drum literally doubles its speed. So say your engine is at 7,000 RPM through the traps, you click it into neutral out of high gear, your drum speed just went to like 14,000 plus. And that's why direct drums blow up and come through the case and your floorboard and take your toes off. And it's a bad day for everybody. So that's one reason why you see aluminum direct drums used in the 400 or a 350 in a trans brake application, is because the aluminum drum is obviously going to take a lot more RPM before reaching that failure point than, say, a cast iron drum will. But that being said, you still want a clean neutral valve body in a 400 if your intention is to click it to neutral at the end of a pass. The clean neutral design changes the hydraulic circuitry where it keeps the direct clutch pack on and prevents the drum from overspeeding, and so you can safely do that. Same thing goes for shutting the engine down through the traps. If you go through in high gear and click the engine off, you're having the same exact problem. You're overspeeding the direct drum. And in that case, the clean neutral valve body won't save you because your front pump's no longer turning, so you're therefore no longer generating line pressure. So your direct clutch vac is therefore not applied, and your drum overspeeds and could kill you. So don't do it.
This begins to sound like a bunch of lawyer stuff. It's like, don't do this because you could die. Don't do that because you could die. I get to say this stuff. What's the proper behavior with a traditional Powerglide? Just asking for a friend.
As far as neutraling it goes?
Yeah.
Well, you don't have the same type of gear train. You only have the single gear set. You're not overspeeding the drum Powerglide when you do that. So definitely much safer to do so.
This question of what to do, whether you allow the whole thing to spin down and, oh my God, I'm stretching the rods, or, do I go into neutral and do this? I mean, this is not a simple question because a lot of people are dealing with this. And as everybody goes faster, and as you mentioned, now we can make stupid power with relatively small money. Everyone's dealing with, why did my LS blow up? Why did my Coyote blow up? Why did my fill in the blank blow up? And there may be reasons beyond just the traditional, well, you put too much power into it, or you forgot to have an oil pump. Those kind of things.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, you definitely need the driver mod as far as how you're running that shifter.
One of the big reasons also for neutraling, and Scott Clark covered his ears, is those of us nitrous guys, we read plugs. And literally, you want to basically shut the car off in power, wide open. I heard it coming. Wide open throttle, kits on, slap neutral, shut that son of a gun off, and get them plugs out. And that's a dangerous, if you aren't set up correctly. I've watched a buddy of mine. I had to tow his car back from the end of the track because he had a piece of drum in his foot and went for the ambulance ride.
Yeah. Yeah, you got to spend the money on good parts. And then, like you say, with the nitrous racer, you got to do what you got to do to get a plug reading. Spend the money on the right transmission part so you can do that safely. Do the aluminum drum, do the shields, do the SFI case, whatever you got to do to keep yourself safe so you can go out and race again.
Mike, did he wait to get in the ambulance to find out what the plug read?
Believe it, when there was transmission fluid dripping off the roof of the car, I don't think he cared.
Oh, man.
Yeah. Real quick, going back to the neutraling thing, a guy's asking if the ADE is under this, or the 480 goes by the same way. Does it need a special valve body? Can we neutral an ADE while we're on that subject?
The ADE definitely applies. It's the same exact style of gear train as in the 400. And if you have a trans brake valve body in an 80 that deletes the intermediate band function, then you absolutely have to follow the same rules with the neutral issue. If you have a trans brake that retains intermediate band function, which there's a lot of them out there that do, then it's a non-issue. You can still safely neutral it.
So, as a follow-up on a couple of, and you know, dude, you're killing it here because we're getting a lot of really cool follow-up questions. This was interesting. I don't know where to go with this. How do OEMs arrange a diode on the AC compressor clutch? Man, I don't know who can answer that question. I certainly can't. Does anybody know? And is that relevant to this conversation? I just want to be clear, because he also asks if you're trying to PMW something, your flyback protection can hamper your efforts. And this sounds like a Scott question, or maybe a Brian question. I have no idea.
If I had paid
On an
attention the whole
AC
time.
compressor, I actually have never paid attention to how it's done in the OEM world. You think I would know that, seeing as I used to design some of those systems?
Right.
I never touched. You know what? I don't
Super
think
disappointed,
that was always
just saying.
built into the compressor, though. I never spec'd that part. I'm sure I've looked at the specs, and I'm sure at one point I remembered how we did it, but I honestly
supposed to know this. Wah, wah.
I couldn't tell you. Yeah.
You did post an answer, by the way. PDMs again for the win here.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's, I guess,
explain that. Unpack that a little bit, okay?
Yeah. So I mean, we're talking about flyback protection. There's a little bit there. You do have to be careful, and that's where selecting your PDM really matters, because not all of them have it, and not all of them have it on every channel, and that's true for ECUs as well. While we're on that, because this also applies to VVT solenoids, any really high frequency solenoid that tends to use a lot of power. And that's where when you see, so like an EC Master Classic doesn't have flyback protection, and you're wiring in diodes to protect the ECU. But a lot of PDMs have that built in, and on top of that, where we're talking about, let's use solid state relays, let's use stuff like that. Well, PDM already has all of that, and on top of that, especially for the carb guys that don't have an ECU to do all the logic, if you already need power distribution, you want a solid state relay for your bump box, whatever, you can use your PDM to do logic on top of that. So, you can do your timer on your bump box. If you want a timer on your button when you let go, not being a drag race guy, I understand how much time you go into that, but once you get your process down, when you let go of that button, all that can be done logically inside of the PDM, as long as the rules let you. And you were talking about, what's faster, your foot, your hands. Well, the fastest thing is going to be the computer, for the most part. I know people will fight that to the end of the day, but 99% of the times, the computers, as long as it's set up right, is going to be the most accurate and consistent way to do that.
Strongest link in the chain, for sure. Right.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Anybody that argues that, I'm sorry, but this argument's over. The idea that a human can be more consistent and quicker than what the computer can do. Now, I'm the guy who's sitting there. I still have my shifter set up in manual mode. And when I decide, I'm a guy who also uses the gear vendors for the last couple hundred feet of the track sometimes because it helps. And I'm doing that manually. But realistically, would that be faster with the computer? Yes, please. So this brings us back to something in the whole transmission and control world. So there were a lot of questions that kind of circulated around this, but Pete, when people are setting up something where they are trying to maximize ET and do all that, is the air shifter a better route? What do you think, or what do you guys recommend that people be doing when they're trying to maximize ET or maximize consistency? And those might be two different questions. I get that.
Air shifter is always the way to go if you're comparing air shifter versus electric shifter. You don't have the amperage draw issues as a electric solenoid or an electric shifter, goes throughout the racing day. The amount of draw that's happening with the solenoid can change, and that can affect how quickly that solenoid is actually moving the shifter. So comparing those two specifics, the air shifter is always going to be more consistent, more predictable, and give you the same result every time. In terms of manually shifting the transmission versus air shifting, I don't care how good of a driver you aren't going to outperform an air shifter, provided everything is functioning properly and tuned properly. It's just not going to happen 100% of the time. So when you're dealing with, these insanely fast cars, you have radial tire cars running 350s. You have, Tom Daly running 5s in a street car. There's a lot of stuff going on very, very quickly, and anything that you can do to improve driver focus and reduce driver distraction, that's always a win in terms of safety. So hands-free shifting, in my opinion, always a wise investment when you're at that level of racing.
Thank you. So we're going to change direction here for a little bit, only based on some questions that came through a little bit earlier in the process. People are always struggling with the idea of, we talked about bolt together converters versus a standard converter, and we talked about a Glide versus a Turbo 400. You guys have kind of a unique process, in my experience, where you don't say, oh, buy a 3,000 stall converter for your Turbo 400 and go do this. You kind of force people to ask a lot of, fill out a lot of questions and go through that process. Can you explain why you do that and why people need to think about that when they're figuring out what they're going to put in their car? And again, we're not talking about deep end of the pool radial versus the world cars, of which are like 28 in the planet. We're talking about most of the guys that are listening to this show and thinking about what they're going to do for their next move and how they're going to do it. And what information do you need to know, and why do you need to know it?
So when it comes to selecting a converter, again, it all comes back to a converter being a load-sensitive device. And so any torque converter, regardless of the advertised stall speed rating, providing a range of stall speed based on the load it's subjected to. So if we deal with our average, street car guy just getting into the hot rod scene, has a small block with a cam and headers and a 4-barrel and, 373 gears and a turbo 350, and, it's easy, I need a 2,500 stall. Well, that may or may not be true. That's because of the converter being a load-sensitive device and providing that range of stall speed based on that load. So we're going to want to know as many engine details as you have. We're going to want to know the type of vehicle, or if you know the weight of the vehicle, the weight of the vehicle. Obviously, the transmission type, and if any mods have been done to the transmission, the rear axle ratio, the rear tire size, how the vehicle's being used. We like to know what your actual performance goals are with the vehicle. If it's just going to be exclusively, a Saturday night special cruiser, it's a street strip car. The more information a customer can provide to us, the better the car is going to perform in the context of the converter selection. So I could take a 12-inch converter that's got an advertised stall speed of 2,500 RPM. I could put it behind that small block example that I brought up, and it may only foot brake to 1,600 RPM and flash to 2,000 because they've got an 8-to-1 350 with a 292 Magnum cam in it, a single plane intake, and the thing doesn't make any torque. I could take that same exact converter and I could put it behind a 496 with a set of oval port heads and a dual plane intake and a mild cam, and the converter is going to foot brake 2,400 and flash 2,900 RPM. So, and that's the same exact 12-inch generic 2,500 converter in two different applications. So that's why we want to know about what you're building and what you want to do with it. Even if you're just doing a basic entry-level deal and you're just looking to spend a couple $100 on a converter, we still want to help you select that right converter for the combination so that you get the max out of the car and that you're getting your money's worth. And the other cool thing that we do here is, even though we have a huge amount of SKUs for shelf stock converters, if you have a combination that, it doesn't need $1,000 or $2,000 custom built converter, but it's also a little bit outside of the parameters of what our shelf stock converters provide, we'll customize one of our shelf stock converters for you and tweak it just enough for your combination so that we're really maximizing the performance potential and delivering on the drivability front as well. So that's an option that we offer to anybody that wants one of our converters. And a lot of times we'll do that at no extra cost. It just depends on which converter we're talking about. So definitely more info, it's better. It's just like with computers, garbage in, garbage out. You're going to be disappointed with the results if you don't help us help you.
I like that. One of the things that has always bothered me, and someone asked on the page, so I'm going to ask, the pros and cons of the ratchet shifter versus the gate shifter. Is the $1,000 shifter really that much better than the $199 special that everyone has used for years and years? What is your take on shifters today?
That's a great question. Having used a wide variety of shifters myself and having come from the $199 shifter into using one of the really trick billet gated shifters, I can personally say from my own experience, I will never use a not trick shifter in anything I build, even if it's just an average street car. They're so much easier to operate. There's so much smoother shifting. There's so many more fail safes in them. Ratchet shifters are good if you're dealing like with one of the higher end shifters, like a Pro Ratchet or something like that, because it actually has a heavier duty ratcheting mechanism in it than some of the street shifters do. And that being said, I mean, you've got, Grandpa's 32 Ford with a ZZ4 and a 700 R4. Obviously, that's going to be fine with one of the more entry-level shifters. But, dealing with race car stuff, put a race car shifter in it. You'll be amazed at the difference. Not only quality, but just overall function.
What about the good old Cheetah, man? That's in every car from 1972 to today. It's still doing the job.
I honestly can't comment. I've never shifted a Cheetah shifter. So I can't say. We have a lot.
You're gonna laugh
we
at
have
me.
a lot of customers that use them.
You're gonna laugh at me, but my favorite shifter is still the B&M Quicksilver. It's a budget-oriented ratchet shifter, but they are smooth and they work.
Yeah, I like the Precision Performance Products shifters. It's hard to beat because they have the Quick Shift 2, which is like their budget shifter, and the only difference is it's got a cast handle instead of a billet handle, and they're super badass. And then of course you got the Mark Mickey shifters, which is like amazing. So
Right.
I have not used a Mark Mickey or thank
Mickey.
you. Is that how his name is properly
Mickey.
pronounced? As Mickey?
Yep.
So
yeah.
Mickey Mouse shifter. Okay. Sorry, I couldn't help myself.
No.
Jesus,
I'm kidding.
here we go.
I know. I'm
Take
kidding.
it back.
I was kidding. It's just the Mark.
Mark's my boy. Take it back.
I'll go back.
Yeah,
and
I know. I'm just, anyway, we're having fun now. But the bottom line is I had the Precision Performance Product shifter, and then you guys are all going to yell at me, but I put the AOD back in the car for a variety of reasons.
Ooh.
Yeah. Try the 3-speed, which meant I went back to, this is just for you, Mike Perduto, to the Cheetah shifter. And it was like, ew. I really couldn't go back to my Hughes Powerglide and the PPP shifter fast enough. There's just sort of a confidence level and everything else. And I got the air shifter stuff, and I'm not even using it, but I'm gonna. I have to learn how to do a little bit of ECU programming, but maybe there's somebody on the show that can help me with that. But the bottom line is there is a complete difference in that. And Mark Dahlquist, I hear you. I ran that stuff forever, but oh my God. And so the Mark Mickey shifter, I don't even know what that would be like. That might be Nirvana, but just the PPP shifter, which you see in so many cars, and you're like, okay, fine, I got one. But anyway, it does make a difference. It does make a difference in feel. It made a difference in how quickly I was able to set it up, which is not a small thing when you're paranoid about having it hang between shifts or not quite be clean on the detents and all that, because that's a part of this. There was a question earlier about is it possible to have too big of a trans cooler, which I think translates to, is it possible to have the transmission fluid too cold, Pete?
Did we lose him? What happened?
I don't know. I see him.
Bill's question went way too long. He got lost.
His webcam looks frozen.
Yeah,
I know.
No,
It said
It was going
it said
so
Galaxy
good.
500. I think it froze and died,
Galaxy
and so
10.
we'll get him back. Whatever.
He'll log back
all
in.
that
I'll
Android
message him
crap.
Everybody
offline.
drink.
Nobody knows what to talk about because he was absolutely running this shit too, man.
Oh,
You know,
my
I had
God.
something, Scott. I had something to talk about real fast because he's our boy, Mr. Dan, the blind machinist, getting his vet and everything ready to go. My pens just showed up today.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Did
Guys,
you
if
get a razor
want to
too,
watch,
Perduto?
I did not get a razor. I did not.
Because I thought you shave your legs, but okay, whatever. He paints his toenails, so don't even. I'm not even.
Paint my toenails.
He paints his toenails, man. It's actually pretty cute.
Do not show us. Do not show us.
I'm not that flexible. I am not that flexible.
Take that old camera down there. Show us your toes.
Oh God, no! Don't take that camera below the desk.
I don't know what happened, but I'm
Some
back.
banjo music
He's
here.
back.
All
There he
right,
is.
Pete. Pete's back. Thank God.
What
Okay,
happened,
all right.
man? He had to take a break.
I have no idea.
Question, Bill.
Oh, go ahead.
What was the question? Does anybody remember?
No.
Oh, we were talking transmission cooling.
Hey,
yes, we were.
Oh, transmission
Too
fluid.
cool, cooler
cold.
too big.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Is it,
so,
is
I
it
mean-
basically? Yeah. Is it possible to have the fluid too cold?
Yeah, the long and short of it is bigger's better with the type of cars we're talking about. You can't overcool it.
So,
Since we were talking
go
about
ahead.
ship,
Go ahead, Brian.
since we're kind of already on this, you want to explain the proper way to adjust your shifter to make sure it's set properly? Because I see people do that incorrectly a lot.
Sure. So in my experience, and again, your mileage may vary based on your own experience. I like to start in second gear with a 3-speed or in high gear with a 2-speed. And you just need it to where the clevis that's going through the shift arm slips in and out of the hole in the shift arm freely in every range. Technically, I say this with some trepidation, with park being the least important, so to speak, because sometimes, particularly with the GM product, you have such long travel between reverse and park that sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to get park to catch consistently. Doesn't happen often, but it can. But you definitely want to make sure, first gear, second gear, third gear, reverse, all of that is hitting correctly. If you get caught up between gears, you're going to burn the tranny up pretty quickly.
So, can you expand on that a little bit? And the direction I'm going with this question is, you're setting up a transmission and shifter, and a lot of times, people are building new combinations for the first time. What is the right way to both set fluid level, set shifter adjustment, and do all of that to make sure that the trans is going to work, it's going to do what I want it to do, it's going to last a long time? What is the process, and what order should people follow?
Well, shifter adjustment, realistically, it's a 2-person job. If you want to do it right, you want to have it 100%, you want somebody in the car that can run the shifter, and then you want to be under the car, so you're doing the cable adjustment yourself. And I recommend running through the cable adjustment 3, 4, even 5 times, just, checking and double checking as much as you can to make sure that thing's 110%. Then as far as filling the fluid level goes on a new build, generally speaking, with most transmissions and the type of cars we're talking about, you're going to put a quart of fluid in the converter, put the converter into the transmission. Once everything's in the car, you can usually start off with like 6 quarts of fluid in the pan, start the engine, and then top it off a quart at a time, reading the dipstick between fillings. And ideally, you want to get to the point where you have some temperature in it before you do the final top off. And the other thing to note on that is that you want to verify your dipstick calibration before you get all this started. So there are some aftermarket dipsticks out there that unfortunately the calibration lines just
Low car.
No. I didn't hear that, but we'll just pretend like
You didn't say it.
So,
you did not say a word, my friend.
right. So, to check your dipstick calibration, you want to drop the transmission pan and see where the calibration lines are in relation to the pan rail. And typically you want the full line to be right at the pan rail or even just above it is okay. If the full line is below the pan rail at all, you need to adjust your dipstick and go up until it's correct. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a low fluid level. And honestly, I'd recommend it with any dipstick. I mean, as much money as guys are spending these days, the extra half an hour it might take to take the pan off and verify that, it's well worth the time invested.
So you've mentioned
We recommend doing that before you fill it. Just saying.
Yeah. Yeah, generally, it's a good idea.
Sorry. Go ahead, Brian.
We're talking about the fill level. Say on a Powerglide, what's the proper way to check the level?
So with the engine running and the vehicle in neutral, obviously you want wheel chocks in place so it doesn't go rolling away on you. You'll check your fluid level that way. And generally, when you're filling it, go ahead and cycle it through the gears quickly and then put it back in neutral and check it again.
So I've got advice from somebody I think pretty highly of that was actually move it through the gears, do the whole thing just to make sure all the circuits are full, everything is full. But you're saying that neutral is probably fine?
Well, you can check it in neutral, and I recommend cycling it through the gears between each addition of fluid that you're making while you're getting up to the final fill volume.
And along those lines, so you're checking the stick against the pan level.
Right.
And are some transmissions, should they be overfilled or underfilled, or what's the right fill level? And does that vary at all between transmission types?
Underfilled, never. Overfilled, yes, there is a time and a place for that. Radial versus the World, Pro Mod cars, you'll typically overfill them. They need that extra fluid capacity just to make sure the pickup tubes stay covered because they accelerate so hard. And you're going to push fluid out of the vent on every pass. So you want a big catch can system in the vehicle where you're catching that fluid that's escaping the vent. But that's how you keep those transmissions alive, that performance level, is to run them typically over a full, like on a low car locking dipstick, you'll typically run them all the way to the top of the bottom locking portion that's actually just above the pan rail on the case.
All right, real quick, I'm going to hit one, and I think Tom's got one for you. Sometimes the converter sticks in the crankshaft, and it looks like it tried to weld itself. Could this be from bad grounding of the solenoid?
100% ground issue. We see that a lot, and the pilot will friction weld itself to the ID of the crankshaft pilot, and 100% of the time it's bad grounding somewhere in the electrical system. Typically insufficient chassis grounding. Especially between the engine block and chassis and or transmission and chassis. So you definitely got to have really good grounds to keep from micro welding.
All right, so my question is, when you go to the track, you see every driver do it a little bit different. What do you recommend for burnout procedures on, say, a Glide and a 400?
Typically on a Glide, you can start in low gear and then shift it into high while the wheels are spinning and, let it roll out of the burnout accordingly. Or you can do a high gear only burnout. I definitely recommend getting it into high gear. It's just not quite as hard on the band, letting the tires grab in low gear. With a 3-speed, 400, you have the intermediate sprag that's going to take a lot of shock in second gear. And so in a 3-speed, you either need to be able to cycle from low gear all the way up into high gear while the wheels are spinning, or actually start your burnout in second gear and then shift it up into high before you let the tires grab. You just don't ever want to let them grab in second gear. Torque flights are actually kind of unique in that you don't ever want to leave the burnout box in low gear, or you'll trash the low roller clutch in the back of the case 100% of the time. So that's another one where you want to be mindful of doing a second gear or high gear burnout.
I guess the next part of that question is, at the end of the burnout, when they roll out, do you recommend, if you have a Powerglide, do you click it into neutral? Do you leave it in second? What do you...
Yeah, like as you're rolling, out of the burnout or rolling to a stop or coasting past the starting line, yeah, clicking it neutral to let it coast, that's no issue at all.
Conversely, is there a doing the burnouts. I mean, there was the burnout question. Is there a difference in how you do burnouts between a 400, a Powerglide, or a 904 or a C6?
I mean, you're doing the burnout. If you're doing it how I just described, you'll be okay. But the C4, C6, 904, 727, low gear burnouts are really hard on the low roller clutch. Don't do them. 400 again, you got to be out of second gear. However, you do your burnout.
I don't understand. I don't understand because I have never had a car that wouldn't do a high gear burnout. I don't understand needing a first or a second or anything. I don't understand why you can't just do a high gear burnout.
Well, cars these days, you should be able to. That should be a non-issue.
Mark, you just never had anything with no power. So
he's our naturally aspirated guy bringing up the rear. Give him a break.
Yeah. Okay. But I think that raises the point, which is everybody comes to the track, and learns a set of behaviors, and they may have been coached by somebody, or they may have sort of figured stuff out on their own, and they didn't really know, or they didn't really learn. So Mark's point about the high gear burnout is great.
Sure.
Not everybody knows that. That's all I'm getting at is, Mark is a very smart guy.
But I mean, it's so much easier to control engine speed. It's easier to control wheel speed. It's so much easier to just do a high gear burnout, and it's easier on parts.
I agree 110%.
Quick question backing up. Someone's asking about your Bara stuff. What Bara specific parts do you guys have available? And what are the options on adapters, trans cases, and torque converters?
Sure. So for those listening that are uninitiated, just real quick, the Ford Bara is an Australian Ford engine platform. It's an inline 6, 4-liter displacement, 24 valve, dual overhead cam, had a production run from 2002 to 2016. The bell housing pattern on the engine block is totally unique to Ford Australia. It's its own thing. So there isn't anything in the US that just readily bolts up as far as OEM transmissions and converters go. So as far as our Bara offerings go, we can put a Powerglide behind them, 350, 400, 4L60E, 4L80E, and Ford C4 currently. And we have pretty much any power level option you can imagine for that. And then on our torque converters, we've developed a specific billet front cover with 8-bolt mounting because Baras are bad about loosening the converter bolts, and the fact plate that's available from Yellowterra, which is also an Australian-based company. So that eliminates the loose converter bolt issue. And something unique about Bara GM hybrid torque converters, they have to be built to a unique height because all the bell housing depths that are available are different than a regular GM bell housing depth. Whether you're running a QuickTime bell housing or a torque power bell housing from Australia or a Delo bell housing from Australia, all three of those options are going to use different converter heights. And we've got all those specs on file with those bell housings. So the way we adapt the transmissions, we just do it with the QuickTime bell housing and bolt it right up to the transmission. We've got the flex plates in stock. We can basically set anybody up with a turnkey package without any bulky, goofy adapter plates or weird hardware or anything like that.
So here's a question, kind of interesting. Do you have any opinions on the filters on the transmissions and the different materials used?
I do. So you'll see typically a screen type filter. That's typically a metal or a plastic screen. Or you'll see what looks like a fibrous, almost felt-like material. It's called Dacron. You'll see Dacron filters used a lot in torque flights, and a lot of late model OEM transmissions use Dacron filters. The Dacron material does a really good job of filtering debris out, which is why it's especially popular in late model transmissions, because you have all the shift solenoids and a lot of moving valves in the valve body that you need to make sure are clean and free of any debris. When you get into a high horsepower application where you have increased line pressure, you have increased RPM, a lot of times a Dacron filter will be detrimental because it actually won't keep up with the flow rate requirements of the front pump and the converter. So you'll see a lot of builders still using Dacron torque flight filter adaptations and Powerglides, or even 400 sometimes. And we're just not a big fan of that. Some guys swear by it. It's great. But we use screen type elements in all of our race builds because they just flow so much more oil. And you're not going to run into any potential pump cavitation or converter cavitation issues with screen type element.
So Pete, on that filter element thing, I mean, you said this, and I think it bears repeating. I mean, the whole idea of using the Chrysler filter goes back to the Stone Age. I mean, once again, that was something we were being recommended to do 40 years ago. You guys also have introduced some kind of new stuff, like you've got this weird angled pan for Powerglide. Can you explain that?
Sure. So the whole idea behind the tapered sump on our Powerglide pan is that it allows the pan and the fluid level to sit parallel to the ground when the transmission's in the chassis. So when you have a Powerglide bolted up to an engine with a regular square sump pan, if you look underneath there, the pan's actually tilted up towards the rear. So we maintain a more consistent fluid level and help keep the filter and pickup covered in oil, especially in harder acceleration. And we've also incorporated a bolt-in anti-slosh baffle inside that pan, which helps keeps the oil from climbing up the rear wall of the pan on high G-force. Again, it's all in an effort to keep the filter submerged in fluid all the time and just have more consistent transmission performance as a result.
So Kevin Kleinweber on YouTube asked a question about aftermarket cases. Quote, any particular company better than the other? So expanding on that question a little bit, also, what's the dividing line between when you need to go to an aftermarket case? Stock case versus aftermarket case? Never mentioned the bell housings and all of that stuff, but how do you parse that question, especially for glides and 400s, which is where all the action is in that space?
Sure. So the thing you got to keep in mind with the OEM case, and this is particularly true with the Powerglide, so we're dealing with aluminum castings that has metallurgy from the 60s. They're old. They have an unknown amount of duty cycles on them. They have an unknown amount of heat cycles on them. And there's only so much you can do to inspect an OEM case to ensure it's a good quality casting that's going to be as trouble-free as possible. So when's a good time to use an aftermarket case and something that's making horsepower? In my opinion, any time. That being said, obviously the aftermarket case doesn't fit everybody's budget. So just kind of general guidelines. Anytime you're getting up around that 1,000 flywheel horsepower mark, or you have a chassis that doesn't have an exceptional amount of reinforcement, that's when you want to get away from a stock Powerglide case. Typically the weak point is at the band adjuster screw area. You'll see them break around that area. And obviously if you break a case, you're getting fluid outside of the case. It gets under your tires. You could catch on fire. You could wet the car up. It's a bad day. So the aftermarket case quickly becomes affordable in that context. On the 400, the castings are actually quite a bit stronger. I mean, guys were running stock 400 cases and 4-second radial cars and pro mods for a long time before the aftermarket cases became readily available, and they're incredibly durable. So throwing 2,000 horsepower to stock 400 case generally isn't an issue. That being said, where you'll break a 400 case is when you get into violent tire shake. You'll tend to crack the case around the rear where the ribs are located, and where the extension housing bolts onto the back of the case. That's where you see 400 case failures. Again, that being said, if the budget allows it, even at a lower power level, an aftermarket case is always a safe investment. And there's a lot more aftermarket cases out there today than there ever have been. We've traditionally always been a sort of a Reed Racing focused company, formerly known as Dead and Bear. Their stuff's all made in California, really high quality stuff. You're always going to get a good case from Reed Racing. We've used a lot of BTE cases, absolutely fantastic piece in the Powerglide. Works really, really well. JW makes cases for the Powerglide. Transspecialties is making Powerglide in 400 cases. There's a lot of stuff out there, and a lot of it's come a long way. So really it just kind of comes down to what you're comfortable running and what fits your budget. But that being said, we're big Reed Racing fans and VTE fans as far as cases go.
So actually, on talking about this, isn't necessarily case related, but same idea. For the same reason, cracking cases and input shafts. As far as mounting of the transmission, I don't know if this is important on drag cars. In the road race and drift world, we run a lot of T101 and G101 dog boxes. A lot of times, guys will hard mount their transmission. Is there any real care on hard mounting versus some sort of bushing or some sort of isolation on the transmission to prevent cracking that or destroying the output shaft or anything like that?
That's a great question, and that's kind of one of those things where you ask 20 different people and you'll get 20 different answers. In my own experience and my own preference, I would say never ever use a solid mount on an automatic transmission. If you're dealing with a full tube car like a Pro Mod chassis, double frame rail, blah 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 blah, a lot of times the transmission won't even physically be mounted in those chassis as far as like a rear traditional mount goes. But when we're dealing with like stock bodied cars that may still have stock frame or at least parts of the stock frame section, stock style suspension, I mean, even if it's got a 10 or 12 point cage in it or whatever, it surges to 850, you still have flex in the chassis. I don't care how good the cage is. If you're dealing with OEM body cars, you're going to be dealing with flex. And so there has to be a deflection point somewhere in the mounting system. A lot of those type of builds will run solid engine mounts or even front and rear motor plates. Honestly, whether you run a stock rubber mount or an aftermarket polyurethane mount, you want a flexible mount on the extension housing of the transmission to prevent breakage of the housing or breakage of the transmission case.
Okay. That's about the same experience we've had. I'm just curious outside of my very narrow application.
Sure.
I want to expand on that application question because we've had some pictures go by, and you guys build transmissions, typically turbo 400s, as I understand it, but I'm welcome to be wrong. But for trophy trucks and monster trucks, is there a difference in how a transmission is built to hold up to that?
Sure. So when you're dealing with monster trucks, our XP4 Powerglide is a really, really popular option. We have quite a few monster trucks out there. And that transmission is still based on conventional Powerglide architecture as far as external dimensions and all that goes. That's all the same. But it has a significantly larger diameter input shaft in it. It's 1 1/4, 29 spline at the turbine side, and it's 1 3/16, 27 spline where it goes through the direct drum and into the planetary. Stock Powerglide, well, I shouldn't say stock, but your typical turbo shaft is just under 1 inch. It's like 0.998. So significant difference in the amount of material in the input shaft. We also run a bigger Turbo 400 style output shaft in those Powerglides. And with just the physically beefier hard parts, that's made those transmissions basically bulletproof in a monster truck. And then in the trophy truck stuff, depending on the power level and what class you're running, some surprisingly stock-ish hard part builds can be pretty durable in the entry-level stuff on the 400s. But when you get up into the real high horsepower, heavy hitting stuff, pretty much everything in the transmission becomes billet as far as the hard parts go. So you're dealing with billet shafts, billet drums, billet gear sets. It's just everything is significantly stronger from a material design standpoint to make them live.
All right, the age-old question that I can't believe it didn't get asked yet. What is the proper spacing on a torque converter, and how do you measure it?
Amen. I know Dan Parker's listening because he would be on the show tonight, but he's busy adjusting thrust. Go ahead. Carry on.
So with the converter fully seated into the front pump, you're shooting for anywhere from 1/8 of an inch to 3/16 of an inch air gap between the converter mounting pad and the flex plate. If you have that amount of air gap, you're good to go and slide the converter forward and bolt it to your flex plate. If you have less air gap than that, then you either don't have the converter fully seated into the transmission, or for whatever reason, the converter's slightly too tall and the height's actually going to need to be adjusted, whether that means trimming the mounting pad slightly, or if it's way off, then a lot of converter height adjustments are actually done internally and the converter has to come apart to make that happen. If you have too much gap, so over 3/16 of an inch, you can use good quality hardened flat washers like the stuff that's available from ARP or similar to use as shims between the pads and the flex plate to get that correct air gap and that correct converter pullout from the pump. And it's not an issue. I mean, there's 6-second cars out there running shimmed converters and don't have a problem. So as long as your fasteners are preloaded correctly, you're not going to have a problem shimming that converter at all. And some transmissions are a little more forgiving on that spec, say like a C6 or a 4L80, where instead of a traditional pump gear that has the drive tangs and a slotted hub, you have a pump gear that's got flats and you have corresponding flats on the drive hub. You have a lot taller gear in there, and so you can pull those out typically, 200, 220 thousandths before you are getting too close on engagement issues. But generally speaking, an 1/8 inch to 3/16 is where you want to be on any automatic, and you'll be guaranteed safe all the time.
And for ease of use, my favorite way to measure that is simply a drill bit. If you can grab those size drill bits and make sure they fit and they fit in there tight, that solves your problem before you're in there with your mic and everything else and confused as to what it is you're doing.
100%. That's a great tip.
So there's another question that kind of bears on that, if I can use that term, which is the influence of converter and transmission on thrust bearing in the engine issues. Can you unpack that a little bit?
So obviously different engine designs use different style thrust flange bearings in them, and some are super, super strong like a big block Chevy, and some are pretty weak like an LS engine or a Ford modular engine. They don't have a lot of surface area to the thrust bearing, and anytime we're reducing that surface area on the thrust bearing, we're reducing the amount of load that bearing can physically handle. And so when you're dealing with a automatic transmission that say is trans brake equipped with a high stall converter, you're going to have a lot higher line pressure being generated by the trans brake valve body, which means you're going to have higher converter charge pressure. So anytime we have an increase in converter charge pressure, we have an increase in the amount of forward thrust force being generated in the converter, which is translated to the flex plate, which is translated to the crankshaft, and consequently the thrust bearing. So the other thing that you have going on, so when you're staging with a high stall converter, is you're building turbine pressure. So in a high rate of vortex flow going on inside the converter while staging, the fluid flow in the converter is physically trying to push the turbine against the front cover inside the converter. And again, that creates more forward thrust force, and the thrust bearing has to take that beating. So when you're dealing with an engine that has a weaker thrust bearing design, there's a lot of things you can do to prevent premature bearing wear or failure. You can run torque converter feed restrictors in the front pump to reduce that charge pressure and help manage that. The converter dump valves that we touched on earlier in the episode, those are going to dump converter charge pressure while you're staging. Those are probably the hands down best way to manage thrust bearing failures. There's other things. You'll see some like adjustable regulators you can put in the cooler line to bypass cooler oil to help manage that. Those work pretty good too. And then of course you can get into engine modifications, whether you're increasing oiling to the thrust bearing through, notching the bearings or creating an additional oiling channel, or if you really want to just never have an issue again, you can convert a lot of these engines to a roller thrust on the front crankshaft journal. It's real common in modular engines and LS engines that are making a lot of horsepower, just have an absolutely bulletproof thrust bearing. My opinion, the roller thrust is a really nice way to go.
Cool. Are there any questions that you guys get frequently that we have missed that we really should be touching on tonight?
A big one for us is people purchasing a converter based on advertised stall speed and then being disappointed when they think it's not providing the stall speed that it should be. And typically people are gauging that based on the amount of stall speed they're achieving against the foot brake. And the advertised stall speed is a nominal rating, which we touched on a lot already. But the thing that people need to realize is that when you're stall checking a converter against the foot brake, you're almost always going to overpower the braking system before you can achieve the true maximum stall speed of the converter. And so if you bought a 3,000 advertised stall speed rated converter and it'll only foot brake to 2,000 RPM, that doesn't mean that you have a defective converter or it's not functioning properly. It just means that you're overpowering the brake system before you can achieve full max stall. So what we look at in those situations is, what is the converter flashing to? So how much engine RPM can be achieved when you're quickly transitioning to wide open throttle, whether it be off the foot brake or from a slow roll. And that's more indicative of what your actual true stall speed is. 9 times out of 10, if you do a flash stall check instead of a foot brake stall check, you'll find that the converter's performing exactly how it was designed to do.
So on that, to kind of, if we're trying to describe our flash stall point and we're beginning to dial in our converter, working with our converter and transmission manufacturer, what kind of data do you want us to provide you in order to, get the basically, we're always trying to do the same thing, which is get the performance maximized with the least amount of changes or frequency of changes possible. So what data do you need from us to do that?
For the love of God, put drive shaft sensors in your cars. Anybody listening who's not running a drive shaft sensor, put one in the car.
But it said I went 140 in the 8th mile, man. Isn't that what you need?
It is unbelievable the level of performance of vehicles that are out there that don't have drive shaft sensors. It blows my mind every single time. We got to have drive shaft data. I don't need a math channel. I don't need an algorithm. I want to see the actual drive shaft line and what the drive shaft is doing. So for us, that's one of the most important sensors in the whole car. And, we'll look at other things too. If it's injected, we'll look at your, the injector duty cycle and how much fuel it's using. We like to see your timing and boost, and, anything that you have in data is generally going to be helpful for us. But again, I plead with you, put a drive shaft sensor in your car.
All right, one last question. I think we're going to start wrapping up. At what horsepower should a person consider going to the larger input shafts, or over 30 spline? We just call them fat shafts, bigger inputs. When do you make that call that's necessary?
Generally speaking, and this is really broad, 2,000 flywheel horsepower is a good working number for that. You can go 2,600 horsepower on a 30 spline 1-inch shaft and not have it fail immediately, but it definitely becomes a liability at those power levels. So if you want a really bulletproof transmission solution for your program that's going to be low maintenance, increasing your input shaft diameter over 2,000 flywheel horsepower is typically going to be beneficial for that.
Awesome. I think that about wraps up. I don't see anything we missed.
Right. I'm here. So far, so good.
Yeah, Pete, this has been awesome.
Insane. Call it a top 5 for sure. If not one of, it's right up there with the Jeff Stacey's and the Big Chiefs. That's what I was telling him. This is a good one. We appreciate it.
Well, I really appreciate you guys having me on. Thank you so much.
Yeah. No, and what's cool is this goes up on a podcast. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, so a couple things people need to know. Pete has created a really cool set of Transmission 101 videos that are on the Hughes Performance site, specifically on their YouTube channel. So it's like, what does a turbo input shaft mean versus a standard Powerglide input shaft? What is a stator? How does it work? What's varying about that? So all of these things that we kind of went through very quickly tonight, Pete has laid out in detail in a great video with a lot of pictures to show, what the window size is on a given stator, and fin angle and fin machining, and all the subtleties that go into how you create a transmission that really works for your application. So if you have questions on this, go to that site, go to the, and Pete, correct me if I'm not right about this, but it's the Hughes Performance YouTube page to get these 101 videos so you can really walk yourself through to understand what do you need, what do you need to be thinking about, and to have an intelligent conversation with your transmission builder, because it really does. not only correct the myths, but fill in a lot of the gaps that I think people have from sort of tribal knowledge. Any other comments on that before we close out, Pete?
No, that's right on the money, and we're constantly expanding the content, uploading new content every week, and we're going to continue to create these series to help educate the consumer. So, yeah, anything if you consider subscribing and all that good stuff, it definitely helps us out quite a bit too.
Cool. All right.
That's outstanding. So, all right, we got his YouTube channel, Hughes Performance on YouTube. What about your website? What's your website address?
HughesPerformance.com, real straightforward. And
Perfect.
We're also on Facebook and Instagram, and we're usually uploading daily content on Facebook and Instagram. So
Nice.
Definitely give us a like and a follow if you don't mind.
Right on, for sure. Everybody do exactly what he says. Okay, cool. Anybody else with anything for Mr. Pete Nichols from Hughes Performance before we let him go?
I think we're good.
All right, cool.
All right,
We'll let
thanks,
you guys
guys.
out of here. Thanks again, Pete. We appreciate it. And stick around for a minute,
All
talk
right.
to the guys while we take it out, and we'll talk to everybody else here next week.
Thank you.